we're here. We made it.
We did.
It's good to see you, Mako.
It's great to see
Um,
you, Julia.
Lots has happened since the
Yeah,
last time we talked.
yeah,
You won the Kuiper Prize for
right.
Public Theology,
Yeah.
and in your acceptance speech, you said, "Beholding the fragments in silence is
Mm,
the only presence we can gift when our friends are suffering."
mm,
And you have these ongoing themes of silence
mm.
and listening. I think about the conversation that you just had with Maestro Jordan about
Yeah,
loud listening. I
yeah,
think about the listening room that you have there at Fuji
yeah,
Farm.
yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about the role of listening and silence in your work as an artist.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think these little things compound, and sometimes I don't even realize that I have a very cohesive message going on. But I was just getting my hair done by a Japanese stylist, and he practices sado tea. And we were just talking about it, so this is fresh on my mind. He was just invited to Rikyu's Omote Senkei's tea ceremony, as he's a beginner, so he observed this time, but he was saying how important it was for him to experience the tea room. And for history of tea ceremony in Japan, tea rooms that Rikyu himself invented in 16th century, really invented because there were no tea rooms other than reception space for banquets, right? So he created this unique tea room that would be dedicated to silence and this nonverbal communication that would often take place when a tea master invites somebody. And he kept on making them smaller and smaller. And at the end, at a tea house called Shinjuan, there's only 1.5 mats of tatami, which so it's tiny, tiny. Only 2 people can possibly fit. And we were talking about why did he do that? And it seems my thought is that during the feudal war period, where there's just so much bloodshed and so much intentional polarity of hatred created against your enemies, so to speak, and factions and warlords vying for power. Likyu decided that the most important thing is to be able to listen, right, and to hear. And in a tea house is a little area called tokonoma where you place flower arrangements and a scroll painting or calligraphy. And whatever the tea master uses, everything matters, right? So every um, cup, every flower pot, every flower, whatever the tea master chooses for tokonoma hanging, it's significant. It's a particular message to you who are invited to sit. And so I think about that often when I'm doing my art and thinking about why art and what are we trying to accomplish? What is the definition of success as an artist? And I'm often drawn back, especially recently, to think about Rikyu's um, form of communication in very, very difficult, intense time. and how he created a form to have not only a invitation and conversation, but about what it means to live and what it means to communicate. And literally, samurai entering the tea house will have to remove his sword because he also invented this entry called nijiriguchi, which is a tiny little square hole. So anybody entering, including a shogun, will have to remove their sword and bow, humble themselves to enter the tea house. And I think in our days with so many fractures and culture wars and wars, um, we to me that may be one of the most important um, ways that artists can serve in society is to create a moment of repose, if only a moment, but help people slow down and have a deep and meaningful communication.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying about humility and entering into something is also so important.
Yeah.
When we listen, we're curious about something, and we're also tacitly saying, I don't know, and
Yeah.
I seek to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to me that Ricky's language of even invitation is one of curation and mystery, of rather than giving a answer to perhaps a question that a visitor may have. The whole point is to open up the question, um, to create space for reflection and deeper realm of thinking rather than a knee jerk, let's say a knee jerk reaction to, especially in war times, of trying to make the decision that would be advantageous to you, and to almost bring that person out of that survival mode into a world which we call culture care, is the assumption of abundance, rather than assumption of scarcity, rather than zero sum game. We always play to survive. Um, I think art is meant to posit something more generous and more generative into the world.
Yeah. And so in that, how how do you find yourself exploring those generative curious tributaries? Where do
Mm.
you see them flowing in thought currents, in culture at large, in your personal work? What How do you track with them?
Yeah, I think that's I'm increasingly think that you need a community to do that well, um, and a sort of an accountability that is empowering and encouraging, exhorting each other to do so, reminding each other. Certainly, worship in all the forms can help. Liturgies like a tea ceremony or any liturgy, even secular liturgies, if we understand them to be part of communicating more deeply, then, that is what we need. Art has the best chance, I think, of creating such moments. But increasingly, we are, our assumptions have slightly shifted, I guess, with technology because we have gone back to, who gets the most attention kind of a thing. And again, this mode of survival doesn't allow us to move deeper into that realm. So I do think communities dedicated to this, which is really creating your own culture care communities around you to have a long-term view and long-term goal rather than short-term gain. And having um, almost like these, alcohol like anonymous meetings, where we confess to our shortcomings daily, that we we're all addicted to something, and we need help, and art can certainly be part of that process of healing.
And I think one of the reasons that we have that model of a 12-step meeting is because there is listening in that meeting.
Yeah.
There is true meeting. I think about what Georgia O'Keeffe said about seeing, and it was related to friendship. Like, to see takes time, as to have a friend takes time. And so it's this idea of community and attentive listening that is the generative act, that is the curious act, that leads to something different.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Julia, because I notice in my church hosts many of those meetings, and they have these questions, right? And any kind of gathering that asks questions that are generative, not expecting people have one answer, but it's just an icebreaker to open the door to many, many ways that we may deal with our lives. That seems to be a way to heal from this knee-jerk culture, knee-jerk reaction culture, where we tend to make things black and white and create we versus them world, and force people to choose, which side are you, and that addiction friend Bruce Herman says our lust for certainty is a sort of an addiction, isn't it? And we need to have these embedded questions that reminds us, that we, even though our tendencies to judge, how do we remind ourselves to just have tea, and listen to the water and tea, and that seems to be very important today. So I think my art has been for a long time affected by Riku's aesthetic, but especially of late, I have been focused on that.
Yeah. And connected to all of that, we were recently in a conversation with a couple of the other fellows, and we were discussing an author, and you were not familiar with this person, and you said, "Who is that?"
Yeah.
Which is another way of saying, "I don't know."
Right.
And it was so profound for me, and we had an opportunity to talk about it later, and we're talking about it publicly now. But what stood out to me was, when was the last time I heard someone publicly admit that they didn't know something? Because we live in this information age where we have access to all of this all the time, and it's presumed that we know everything, right? And to take that position of, I don't know, to not rush in with a covering over of that, but to, in the manner of 12 step, admit a problem,
Yeah.
admit not a problem, just admit a reality.
Yeah.
Like there is no way that we can know all of the knowledge that there is, right?
Yeah.
And the more honest we get with that,
Yeah.
the more we actually have a stable foundation.
Mhm.
And so I would pose, not necessarily to you, but to everybody that might be listening to this conversation, when was the last time they admitted, I don't know?
Mm. I I so appreciate that, Julia, because I do know that in my journey that hasn't always been the case. I would feel insecure, just admit, especially in public sphere. But I think this is part of the discipline of practicing what I preach. Like I actually think that, and part of it I think was our journey as fellows in Pasadena those years, um, where we really wrestled with, what is knowledge and what is it's a seminary, so you ask these questions from theological perspective, but really from a human perspective. Um, uh, how can we be a presence of grace when not everything is like on the surface institution exists. Everything is on the surface seems to be solid, but we know internally it's not, right? So it seems to me like if we can all have that, at least this attitude of tell me more, attitude, rather than, oh, here's what I know about the subject and I'm competent, and and worse yet, you're not, kind of a typical, that happens a lot in a school. So I think you want to develop, younger s- students who can be deadly honest, and I think that's actually one of the great advantages of today's youth culture, is that they are pretty transparent and honest. And I must admit, I've learned a lot from my kids. And I learned that, as I get to know some of the younger fellows, I'm learning from them, like, ask these blunt questions that that is not, that we in our generation would just nod our heads and say, "Yeah, sure, yeah, I know about that." But and I think that's important. It's an important discipline.
Yeah. And I think it ties back into listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it's all part of that generative loop.
Right. And I think you do this, Julia, but in my studio, I explain what I do. I'm actually writing about it right now. Um, let's say I invite a guest to come in, just like the queue would invite a guest. And how do I want the flow of my experience of creating art in the studio be translated to people who are, sojourners, who are coming into the studio? And I think more accurate description of what I do in the studio is not necessarily just painting, but it's really listening. It's listening to paint, and learning from what I am creating. And because every time the attentiveness, if we're attentive to what is happening, it's new. You could use the same materials over and over, same technique over and over. There's never a moment where I feel like, oh, I same thing, I was able to control it. and I don't want to anyways, but even if I did, there is something to that, again, honesty of saying, oh, this is interesting because it's never happened before, and maybe in the past I would have said, oh, I made a mistake, but maybe today I say, oh, tell me more, like to my paintings. And so that's really it's a really a pregnant question, because that I noticed that happens in writing. When I was writing out the Kuiper talk, um, I realized so much of it was trying to listen to, first of all, the voice of the spirit, but also, people that I have been influenced by, right? So, you know, Tim just passed away, and that remains very potent in my mind. But Dr. Mao and others who have influenced my thinking, I'm re-engaging or visiting these questions again, and this time I want to listen better, right? So that writing is listening as well.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And that's such a paradigm shift, because most people would think of writing as speaking,
Yeah, right.
and even image making as speaking.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's listening and reflecting
yeah, yeah.
more than the direct action of speech.
Yeah, and speech, in that sense, still holds as a way to communicate, right? So, I think what we mean is that developed sense of listening is speaking, right? That's rather than the other way around. And so maybe that's an approach to life, to enter into every situation, as like I do here in the studio, never expecting um, the same thing, but always pay attention and learn from new opportunities and improvise. And I remember Kari, uh, fellow, doing these improv exercises, and as an actress, she does that regularly. But I found them really refreshing, because you really have to pay attention, right? and and then say yes to that moment. That's one of the rules, is to say yes. So you receive and then you create something, and just it's that's a great attitude to have, when we're living our lives.
Yeah. So, in light of all of that, how do we say, I don't know, and yes,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Hmm.
I think that's
Yeah.
kind of a takeaway from this conversation, learning to be even more inquisitive,
Yeah.
and in what we find,
Yeah.
say yes to it.
Yeah. And hurry slowly, right? That idea that, right, these paradoxes can exist
Yes,
simultaneously in one moment. And
yes,
because part of our thinking, that creating dualism in our minds is because it's simpler, right, to not accept the complexity, and to just mechanistically follow what we think is the right action. But in reality, the world is full of mystery and paradoxes and contradictions. And I think what we find as artists is that we are closer to the truth when we accept the complexity and even paradoxes of how that comes to us, it's the burning bush, burning yet not consumed, and how every action is, you know, um, something that we behold, and every speech is something we hear, ourselves, and that kind of mastery of senses, maybe, because I keep reading about how we see and how we hear, and all these signals are crisscrossing, and you know just because we see a chair and we can name it a chair doesn't mean that we are seeing the chair, and so it's fascinating to me that this kind of even mystery and ambivalence about the world is critical in understanding the truth, understanding what is solid, that it's not when we eliminate necessarily possibilities, but when we see the generative possibilities of that one thing and scratch our heads like, how could that be true? That's kind of when we are closer to so-called truth. And so artists tend to be people who've been trained in that, because we face it every day. Creating something is always a process of opening up the question, and so maybe we are suited for that journey, as border stalkers, meandering and then discovering, and but at the same time, the world, otherwise we will end up just decimating the very things that we love, whether it be in defense of ideologies or whatever we're fighting for, and we need that nuance. So I appreciate this conversation, because this I think brings us back to what cultural care is. It's not this, people want nice definition and we try to give it, but it's really a journey into the mystery of complexity. And if we can define our enemy in that sense, we're doing what culture wars does so well and in devastating ways. So how to love our enemy, right? Is a different way and a different path.
I think of the line in Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, when I know my enemy, I love them.
Yeah.
And that recognition that we are the enemy,
Yes.
like
Yes.
it's all one. It's not
Yeah.
this and that.
Right.
It's the same.
Yeah. Well, it's something we fear in ourselves, right?
Yes.
That's when we commit to separating ourselves, because we're so afraid of that which we which we struggle with. And if that's the case, then whenever that happens, that's an opportunity for dialogue, opportunity to say, tell me more, and that may lead to a greater awareness, certainly of ourselves, but that breaks open the cycle of this cycle of closed-mindedness and even violence. And it's like in To Kill a Mockingbird, when Scout asks, um, this using the word that she just learned, entailment, and she asks a neighbor who is so set on being right and judgment against the brother, and and she asks, isn't aren't you doing the very thing that you said not to do, and these questions really, I think, help us in that case. A beautiful writing also helps to identify something that is real about what what you were just saying. It's part of our own fears that create these dualities. Yeah.
So let us go forth and be fearless.
Amen. Sounds
Thanks
good.
for talking, Mako.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this beautiful conversation, Julia.